Ferguson, Paisley, Trapanati, Hitzfeld, Gutmann, Wenger, Heinkes, Mourinho, Pereira, Ancelotti, Pep, Klopp. All of these are household names for any football fan. Yet, arguably, one of the greatest managers in the history of the sport and a guy who is a real innovator somehow gets left out of this conversation. Let me introduce you to one Valery Levanovsky, the greatest manager, which no one remembers. Hey, this is Professor Matt, and welcome to the Too Many Guys Soccer podcast. And this is the second episode of an ongoing series dealing with the history of the sport and the intersection of the sport and larger socio-political events. And it's the first of sort of a mini series within a series, right? As the continued conflict in Ukraine continues to spiral, I thought it was a good idea to include a series of videos dealing with certain aspects of football and Ukrainian history and how these things intersect and connect. And I decided to record this first short on a really important figure in footballing history, but a guy which by and large people in the West don't know of, or simply he's a footnote, which is kind of incredible because all of those managers that I mentioned at the top, these are great managers. But I've always been a big believer in degree of difficulty. And last I checked, none of these guys, even Ferguson, who I as a Liverpool fan actually have massive respect for because of his longevity and the fact that he was able to not do just one cycle, he did cycles in different eras with different kinds of players. Vladimir Levanovsky, from the early 1970s to the early aughts, was able to do the same thing, but do it in a totally different climate. And he's the only manager that I'm aware of that's been able to do it after the collapse of an entire system, an entire country. And so I think he has to be included in any conversation when we're talking about great managers of the past. Who was this guy? Well, he was born in 1939, so right before the outbreak of World War II. And he was the son of factory workers. His father was also a Red Army veteran during the war, as most men of that generation in the Soviet Union were. He was an athletic, precocious kid. By the way, he was born in Kiev. And, he had a pretty unremarkable, but fairly lengthy, playing career with Ukrainian clubs, both in the Soviet Vysshaya Liga, so the Soviet Premier League, and the Soviet First League. He started out with Dynamo Kiev, his boyhood hometown club, and the club he's most associated with. And he stayed on for a year or two, but he really made his bread and butter at Chernomorets Odessa and at Shakhtar Donetsk. And he played left wing from 1957 to 1968. Again, a unremarkable sort of career. No one would confuse him as any sort of star. And, especially at Dynamo, he wasn't even a starter. He was just a solid squad guy to come off the bench if you needed goals. However, he did have a reputation as being a very smart player. And this obviously is going to lead to what happens next. Almost immediately, he's able to get his coaching badges, which he was working on towards the end of his playing career, because getting accredited as a coach in the old Soviet Union was not particularly easy. These badges weren't just given out. And he takes a job as a first-time manager at Dnipropetrovsk, club which some of you guys might remember. They made the Europa League final and lost to Sevilla back in 2015. They unfortunately no longer exist. They went bankrupt a couple years ago, but there's another club, Dnipro One, in its place now. And it's as time at Dnipro where the attributes, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later, of him as a manager really start to come in. Dnipro was, languishing in the Soviet First Division, and within literally 2 years, takes a job in 1969, and he's there from 69 to the end of the 72-73 season. He's able to get the club promoted back into the Soviet Vysshaya League. He wins the first league in 1971, and he lays the foundation of what's going to be a very successful 2 decades for Dnipro. He leaves in 73, but his DNA is all over this club. And, they were a solid, particularly club side in the 1970s. And then they finally, in the early 80s, broke through and won 2 Soviet leagues during the last decade of the league's existence. But it's really his return to his boyhood club, Dynamo Kiev, in 1973, that when things really start. He hooks up with a former a former teammate from his playing times, another guy who, was a solid squad player, but really wasn't anyone of note, by the name of Oleg Bashelik. And Bashelik was sort of the Peter Taylor to, Levanovsky's Brian Clough. And, he serves as his assistant manager both at Dynamo in the 70s and in the 80s. And then he goes on and takes, the managerial job at Shakhtar and does pretty well for himself, actually. And also at the same time with the Soviet national team. More about that in a minute. Levanovsky's career could be broken down into several stages, or several eras, quote unquote. And for this stage is from 1973 to 1990, where he is the firm hand at the wheel at what in that period was the most dominant club in Soviet football, and really the flagship of Soviet football in European competitions. To be fair, he had some advantages. He takes over Dynamo Kiev at just the same time as a political turnover in Soviet Ukraine. Petro Celeste, who was the party secretary from 1963 to 1972, is replaced in 73 under murky circumstances. The sort of consensus was that he was too Ukrainian for the likings of the party in Moscow, particularly when it came to cultural and linguistic policies. And he's replaced by a guy by the name of Vladimir Shyvyatsky, who is the first party chairman for first secretary of the party in Ukraine from 72 to 89. Shyvyatsky is most remembered for his Russification campaign in Ukraine and being sort of the face of stagnation in Soviet Ukraine. He's a Brezhnev colleague of Brezhnev, and he pretty much toes the standard Brezhnev line. He is, however, a degenerate football fan, and up until the early 70s, it should be noted, Dynamo had won a couple league titles before. But Soviet football really was dominated by 4 Moscow clubs: Spartak, Dynamo Moscow, Central CSKA, the Central Red Army team, and Torpedo Moscow, which incidentally just got promoted to the Russian Premier League in a season that now means nothing. But nevertheless, it's under Levanovsky's watch, and with generous support from the party authorities in Ukraine, that Dynamo Kiev breaks the Moscow stranglehold over the league and becomes not, I would just say, the unofficial national team of Ukraine, right? Because the Soviet Union, much like Yugoslavia in the last video, was a multi-ethnic society with 15 individual republics based around national lines. but also kind of the club or everyone else's, unless you root for a Moscow side, everyone else's second favorite team, because their breaking of that stranglehold is a big deal. And, I years ago wrote an article about this where, Soviet Union fan letter writing was a big thing. And so you had these, fans write into the club. And as you'd suspect, there's a lot of Ukrainians who are like, hey, thank you, but letters from other nationalities, Armenians, Georgians, etc., but also a lot of Russians outside of the capital. So Dynamo didn't just become, the unofficial national team of Ukraine, they became the unofficial team of the Soviet periphery versus the Soviet center. And his success between the early 70s and, 1990 is staggering. He wins 8 league titles, 6 Soviet Cups, 3 USSR Super Cups, which was their equivalent of, the Super Pokal or the Community Shield. And most impressively, it's under his watch that Dynamo, but also really Soviet football, gets rolling in Europe by and large. Soviet teams had participated in European competitions before the 70s, but very rarely, if ever, they got past the group stage. Under Lewandowski's watch, these things changed. He wins the Winners' Cup twice in 1975 and 1986. He wins the European Super Cup in 1986 and does pretty well in terms of the European Cup, or what will eventually become the Champions League. In 1977, the team reached the semifinals, and arguably those teams from between 75 to about 79 were probably the best of the sort of first wave of his Dynamo teams. And then again in 1987, he reached the quarterfinals of the tournament 3 additional times, in 1976, 82, and 83. It's also under his watch that at Dynamo, you get the first 2 of eventually 3 Ukrainian, well, in this case, Soviet Ukrainian, but Ukrainian Ballon d'Or winners. The talismanic tall striker Oleg Blokhin in 1975, who, if you've never watched videos of Blokhin, do it. When people ask me, about Lewandowski and like what his style of, and look, Lewandowski, I think it was a better striker. But in terms of his style of play, I'm always asked, who does he remind you of? And I'm like, well, it's Oleg Blokhin. It's eerily similar. And in 1986, Igor Belanov. This is really unparalleled success, not just in the Soviet League itself, but also in Europe. Dynamo Kiev became, in the 1970s, the team from the Soviet Union that people in the West knew, because you inevitably saw them in European competitions and in the knockout stages of European competitions. What makes this more incredible, for me anyway, is that he's doing this while also, for a large portion of this period, doing double time as the manager of the USSR national team. The Soviet Union's national team, the 60s were a great decade for them. They win the inaugural European Cup in 1960. They lose in a pretty good final in 1964 to Franco's Spain. And then in the World Cups of 62 and 66, they make deep runs. 62, they get to the quarterfinals. 1966, they get to the semifinals, only losing to runners-up West Germany. And to be fair, I don't want to, piss off England fans. You have to wonder what that final, had the Soviets gotten through, would have looked like. Because I actually think that Soviet team matched up better with that England team. But that's story for a different day, a different conversation. After about 1966, though, things go in decline. That golden generation that was highlighted by Lev Yashin, and they all retire pretty much all at once, because the way that the Soviet Union did its national team setup was they would promote a whole bunch of players all at once. And so, like, the football ran almost on 5-year plans. It's like, okay, we have this crop of guys in the, U17s. We'll bring them up all at the same time at the U21s. And then when they're ready, we'll bring them all up at the same time for the senior team. The generation that followed, that sort of golden generation of the early to mid 60s, just really wasn't up to it. And, the Soviets get to the European Cup in 68, but they go out early. And then after that, the early 70s are really a barren period. They don't qualify for World Cups. They don't really qualify for European championships. So Lewandowski's given the keys to the car in preparation for the 1976 Olympics. And, the Soviets, not just in football, but also in, ice hockey, basketball, those had an advantage in so much that because in the Soviet Union, professional athletes weren't considered professional, so they could, play. But if you look at the team that Lewandowski takes to the Olympics, it's actually more of an experimental team, more of like what would be an Olympic team now. A lot of very young players, not just from Dynamo Kiev, from throughout, the Soviet League system, and a couple trusted veterans from his, Dynamo squads, particularly obviously Blokin. And they win the gold medal, and they beat out actually a really good Polish team, and arguably maybe the best East German team ever assembled. And by the way, the nucleus of what would become those those French teams in the early 80s. So not, against pretty decent competition. And it's the nucleus, it's the core of this, squad that comes in, the 76 Olympics that he's going to grow and mature and nourish, moving forward. Because he then steps down and things kind of stagnate until he's recalled for the qualification for the 1982 World Cup. And from about 1982 to 1988, you have this sort of second Soviet, golden generation. Guys, again, mainly the core of his Dynamo teams, but guys from Spartak, a lot of Georgian players from those Dynamo Tbilisi teams are very competitive at that time, etc. And, again, he's doing this while he's managing Dynamo Kiev. 1982, the Soviets give a very good account of themselves. They're able to get out of the group stage for the first time since 1966. But it's really 4 years later in 1986 where everything comes together. All of these players mature at the same time. And, they get to the quarterfinals only to lose in a crazy 4-3 match against Belgium. But it's really 1988, 2 years later, where they finish runners up in the Euros to the Netherlands, that I think probably was his best team. It was a largely veteran group, but it was a group that, had played together pretty much for, a decade. And if it's not for Marco van Basten, I think they win that Euros. They were in the same group as the Netherlands. And by the way, they were in a group they're a pretty competitive group. They're in the same group with the Netherlands and England. They dispatch England. I mean, it's a beat down. And they beat the Dutch 3-1 in the groups. And I think that's more realistic of where the teams were, because I think if you replay that final 10 times, the Soviets win 7 of them. The other 3, the things you can't account for is Marco van Basten literally takes over the match, and that's what he did. The Soviets played well, but they had no answer for a great player, which, hey, especially in cup competitions, that can happen. We hope that happens, Saturday. Anyway, in 1988, the Soviet national team comes, runners up to the Dutch. Dynamo is dominating the domestic league. But this is where it gets crazy. Then everything goes to hell in a handbasket. The Soviet Union, which beginning in '85 with Gorbachev's economic reforms, Perestroika, and then his political liberalization, Glasnost, made what was not particularly a healthy Soviet system, but one that was still working and chugging along, uh, completely destabilized it. And in 1990, uh, the Soviet League system effectively collapsed. The Baltic states, and there is a Lithuanian team in the Soviet Vishaya League at the time. I was like, there, it's Vilnius. The Georgian teams, the Armenian teams, and then eventually the Ukrainian teams all say, no, we're pulling out and we're forming our own leagues. And so Levinovsky is in a weird place. And so is his team, because for the first time now, his players could go and get paid in the West. And you see, beginning in 1988, when the Soviet Union liberalizes, it's the Soviet FA liberalizes its rules and guys can go West. You have this mass exodus of Soviet talent. And you also have a mass exodus of Soviet managers because, right, these guys haven't gotten paid either. Levinovsky resigns after the 1990 season, which, by the way, Dynamo is the last season they're in the league, which they win the league. And then he goes and offers his services to the highest bidders. His English was non-existent. So, obviously we didn't see him in England. We didn't see him in Western Europe either, which I think is a bit of a shame. He winds up like a lot of Soviet managers in the Middle East, in the UAE and in Kuwait. And he does relatively successfully this period between 1990 and like 1997, where he's this gun for hire in the Arab world. And, he makes these teams better. He actually wins 2 UAE league titles. Gets Kuwait into the knockouts. He was the Kuwaiti national team manager into the knockout rounds of the Asian Cup. But, it's relatively sort of unsatisfying. Meanwhile, while he's in, the Middle East, Ukraine has now become an independent nation. They have their own Vishaya Liga, Premier League. Dynamo dominates the league almost by default because they were the flagship team in Soviet Ukraine. And, this is one of the reasons why there's such an intense rivalry between them and Shakhtar and, medalist Kharkiv. The other clubs are kind of farm systems. And this goes back to what I was saying before about the support that the club got. These are really unofficial support from the Ukrainian Communist Party. That all goes away. And even though the club is domestically successful, it's doing it again by default. And the league itself, and mirrors Soviets, post-Soviet Ukrainian society. Ukraine gets shock therapy capitalism, and that doesn't particularly work well with football, particularly football, which up until that point really was state-driven. There were some reforms in the late 80s that sort of semi-commercialized Soviet football. There were a lot of much more far-reaching reforms that were planned, but they were never implemented. And so a lot of historic teams go under. There's a talent drain, just like there's a talent drain, in all sectors of Ukrainian society. Young, talented people are leaving in their, masses to go west. And things are not good. Things are not good. And the stadiums, the infrastructure is just falling apart. And dare I say, too, the stadiums aren't, being packed because people all of a sudden who, enjoyed a really healthy social safety net now are scant. And, football, going to a football match on a Saturday, even though that's great escapism, isn't top priority when you have to feed your family. And now you have to pay for things like rent, and education. In 1997, Lewandowski returns from the Middle East. And this, I think, is where we really have to put him in the pantheon of great managers. Because what he does in the late 90s is borderline incredible. Because, right, by the time we get to the 1990s, we have entered really the modern age of global football. It's not, countries owning clubs quite yet, but we're getting there. The advent of Berlusconi and big money in Italian football in the 1980s, the birth of the Premier League in England, and really the hardening of this West versus East football divide. All the money, all the talent is in the West, and it's in these 4, 5, maybe big leagues. Lewandowski returns to Ukraine, and Ukraine is an absolute basket case. Uh, and he does over the next couple of years something borderline remarkable. He takes a squad of guys who, and it's not 1967 Celtic, where they were all born like within a couple blocks from the stadium, but he takes a squad of players who were all born either in Kiev or in the greater Kiev area, and one random Georgian in Kaka Kaladze, and forges them into one of the most exciting and fun, genuinely fun teams of that period of European football. Those are the teams of Alexander Harlanenko, Oleg Luzhny, who winds up in Arsenal, Andrei Shevchenko, and Sergei Rebrov. And this squad goes on a crazy run. Not only do they dominate the league, they kill the league. There's 2 undefeated seasons there. The goal differences you can look it up, are stupid. But it's what this team does in Europe that I think is important. He comes back, they win the league in 97. They get to the Champions League in 98. Now, they had been to the Champions League before, right, as Ukrainian champions, but I mean, they were cannon fodder. In 98, he's able to get them out of the group stage. And by the way, it was a group that featured Barcelona. They beat Barcelona on aggregate, the 2 ties, 7-1. They went into the Camp Nou and they put a beating on a very good Barcelona team. And they get to the quarterfinals. The following season, 98, 99, he does one better. They get out of a group with a pretty good Lens team, Panathinaikos, okay, and Arsene Wenger's Arsenal. And this is the team. These are the Dynamo teams that I remember and who I loved growing up. And right, particularly the Arsenal match at the old Olympijski Stadium in Kiev is the one that I remember because a very arguably one of Arsene Wenger's best Arsenal teams gets absolutely pimp slapped 3-1 by this team, this international team of stars assembled, at Arsenal, get pimp slapped by this team of essentially local homegrown kids. They then do it better. They get to the quarterfinals and defeat Real Madrid 3-1 on aggregate and come yay close to making that final with Man United. They lose over 2 legs to Bayern Munich 4-3. But the match at the Olympijski is crazy. And if you can find it on YouTube, it ends 3-3. It's an absolutely crazy back and forth match. And, if you look at the salaries, and the resources at the disposal of both these clubs, it shouldn't be 3-3, right? I mean, Bayern starting 11 could have paid for 4 Dynamo starting 11s at that time. And this, again, I go back to is where I think we have to include Lewandowski in the conversation because we've seen managers. I had mentioned Alex Ferguson. who engaged in rebuild, cycle, and was able to maintain an immense. I will, as a Liverpool fan, I feel dirty saying this, but I give Alex Ferguson a lot of credit because he was able to maintain a certain level of success over a sustained period of time in very different eras. But last I checked, Sir Alex Ferguson never did that in a country which literally did not exist, a decade earlier, a country that was a economic, social, political basket case, playing in a stadium that was a giant Soviet concrete dome, bowl thing, which moved. And with a squad of guys that were effectively all homegrown players, save for one random Georgian guy that somebody scouted and it was like, oh, he's good. That's incredible. The fact that I always said that those Dynamo teams represented that one door in an era that was dying, that era where you could create and forge a really competitive team through mostly homegrown guys, but also one foot in this new sort of global, big money era of football. And what those teams did, particularly in the Champions League those 2 seasons, is borderline remarkable. The following season, he also, again, because I guess he was sucker for work, takes on double duty and becomes the Ukraine manager. Now, unfortunately, that project and the continued success at Dynamo is cut short by his untimely death in 2002. And to be fair, after 1999, he's sort of, at work cycling again, because it's after 1999 that the big players on that team pretty much leave in bulk. Kolodze and Shevchenko obviously go to AC Milan. Olezhnitsky goes to Arsenal, and Sergei Rebrov goes to Germany, and bounces around the Bundesliga for a bit. Lewandowski is charged with the task of rebuilding once again, and that rebuild, he's only there for part of it. But he does cycle in some pretty important names and good players for Dynamo, particularly Oleg Kusev, the right back, etc. He also is engaging in a rebuild of a building, if you really want to put it, of the Ukrainian national team. The Ukrainian national team in the 90s was dog shit. Pardon my French. They were bad. And they were bad because there's no infrastructure. Even though a lot of the Soviet national teams had a disproportionate Ukrainian, component, Russia got all the awards, old records, and initially kept a lot of really good players, right? A lot of Ukrainians, Oleg Solenko in 1994, the leading goal scorer at that World Cup, being one of them, all of a sudden got Russian passports real quick because they were like, aha, Russia has a much better chance of winning something than Ukraine does. So a lot of really good Ukrainian players opted to become Russian. And I mean, again, the FA is literally starting from scratch. If you look at pictures of the early Ukrainian teams from the early 90s, you'll be very confused about the kits because the colors don't mesh. Well, the reason they don't mesh is because they were hand-me-down kits that they got from Romania, and just plomped, Ukrainian, the Ukrainian badge on it. They're terrible. By the late 90s, partially because of the success of his Dynamo teams, you do see an improvement. In 1998, they're able to get to a World Cup playoff. They ultimately lose over 2 legs. But it's when Lewandowski takes over in 2000 that the groundwork for a pretty good Ukrainian generation, one which I think slightly underachieved, but nevertheless, one that is going to cause problems for the rest of Europe. really springs up. And and here again, it's not just his Dynamo guys. He makes a point to introduce into the national team young Ukrainian players from throughout the league, and guys who are also playing in Europe. Uh, the obvious names here are Anatoly Timoshuk, who we've talked a little bit about recently on the podcast, and ex Liverpool man, Ukrainian porn star Andrei Voronin, who's actually not even playing with Trudamar Tedes's senior team when he got his first call up. And even though Lewandowski unfortunately dies in 2002, he's not able to see this out. It's that core that Oleg Blokin, former Ballon d'Or winner, takes with him in 2006 to the World Cup, and who wind up getting knocked out in the quarterfinals to the best Italian team I've ever seen. Looking at his career as a whole, it's kind of remarkable. Like I said, domestic success, and look, we can say, oh, it was the Ukrainian league, and that's true. But his earlier stuff in the Soviet League, you can't really say that. I mean, the Soviet League had a coefficient; they had the third highest coefficient in Europe in the late '80s. It was actually a really competitive league with a lot of good teams, and the fact that they were able to dominate that league, I think, says a lot. But what he was able to do in Europe with pretty much no funds, and also doing remarkably well with national squads, he has to be put into the conversation. Again, degree of difficulty, done. None of the great managers, and I'm not saying he's better than your Peps, your clubs, etc., but no manager that I'm aware of has had to go through that kind of political, social, economic mess. I mean, the guy's he begins his managerial career in a country that at the end of his managerial career doesn't fucking exist. Doesn't exist. It's quite remarkable. What a little bit about his sort of tactics, innovations, what kind of manager was he? The best the best way I can look at it is imagine, imagine Arsene Wenger and Jurgen Klopp had some strange Ukrainian kid. He was known as a player's manager. He was very much a hug merchant, but he was also a real innovator. And he actually wrote a book, which I've read. You can get it in English. Buy it on freaking Amazon. I checked before this for like $700. I don't recommend you doing that. Fucking steal it or something. Called The Methodological Basis of the Development of Training Modes, which sounds like the most goddamn Soviet boring ass title of a book imaginable. And in some ways it is. But it also has some really interesting points that do come out. Lewandowski teams, even though they morphed, they changed over time. More about that in a second. The essence was always sort of a collective. And this took different forms. In the 70s, it was sort of total football Soviet style. In the 1980s, when he was playing a lot of three in the back, particularly for the Soviet national team, it resembled sort of Neo Catenaccio from Italy. Right. And then in the 1990s, those teams that, made those runs in the Champions League, he was gegenpressing before it was called the gegenpress. He very rarely had a particular formation. It's probably, had his most success with a 4-1-3-2. But, he also, like I said, especially for the Soviet national team in the 80s, a lot of three at the back, a lot of use of wing backs. So tactically, he was rather innovative. And he was always, and he says this in his book, he says, in order to be a, successful manager, You have to stay in touch with modern trends. And in that sense, maybe that's one of the reasons why he is so successful with Dynamo post 1991, whereas a lot of very good Soviet managers from the 70s and 80s fall on their face once the Soviet Union collapses because they've been in this echo chamber. Whereas Levinovsky constantly was churning things over, constantly reinventing, his teams, constantly reinventing his styles. Far from sort of having his football in the freezer in this iron curtain, he was following what was going on in the rest of the world, and he was taking notes. The other thing I mentioned, Arsene Wenger, is he was doing Arsene Wenger stuff before Arsene Wenger was doing Arsene Wenger stuff, or at least before Wenger was doing it at Arsenal. The book in question, again, which is really sort of boring, is remarkable because it's written in the late 70s and he's already talking about sports science. And how his players shouldn't be smoking cigs and diets and things like that, and in that respect, way, 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 way ahead of the curve. The fact that he isn't remembered outside really of, Ukrainian or, uh, post-Soviet football enthusiasts is quite remarkable and I think rather sad to me. A guy who had that much success, one was the first Soviet manager to win any kind of European silverware, to have done double time with national teams and the domestic teams and have a level of really profound success. And again, degree of difficulty. This man's career started in one country, and at the end of it, it was in a country that didn't exist. Is somewhat remarkable. He died entirely too young. But if you look at his accolades, again, 3 Ballon d'Or winners, Blokin, Belenov, and ultimately Shevchenko. I mean, Shevchenko still, in interviews refers to him as a father figure. Hero of Ukraine, hero of Soviet socialist labor, which I think is really cool that being a football manager was considered labor. I think that's really that's wise. Master of sport in the USSR, distinguished coach, manager of the year essentially of the USSR, 8 times. That's not small potatoes, and got the FIFA Order of Merit. Guy of note, guy of note, and probably the greatest manager certainly to come out of the Soviet or post-Soviet space. And a guy who I believe, again, is he the greatest manager of all time? No, I don't think that. But when we're having that discussion, maybe you should maybe you should insert my boy in the conversation. Because all I'm going to say is if you gave this guy the resources, screw Pep, that even a club or, a mid-table Bundesliga team has. You wonder what the heck he could have done. And again, the fact that he was so innovative and forward thinking in a Soviet footballing establishment that almost suppressed those kinds of thoughts it says a lot. Anyway, this is Professor Matt, and this is the Too Many Football Guys, Too Many Guys Soccer show. And looking forward to talking with you guys soon. Take care, and dos vidania.